As Robert mentioned, I'm Peter Campbell, Associate Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. So I want to do a quick run through of a few things about me just to head off some overly technical questions. So I did my BA in philosophy at the University of Winnipeg in Canada. So if you hear a funny accent coming through, that's what it is. I did my master's in war studies at King's College London in the UK, where I studied counterinsurgency, CLAUSEWITZ, and then I wrote my thesis on the US Marine Corps' combined action platoons in Vietnam, which was a method of counterinsurgency that the Marine Corps used. I then did my PhD in political science at the University of Notre Dame, where I wrote my PhD on military innovation in the US Army from Kennedy to today. And now I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. I teach international relations, the causes of war, the development of strategic thought, and national security decision-making. And that is all, I present all those points to you simply to point out that I am not a specialist in anything related to computers, right? As you could see with the difficulty I was having with screen sharing and Zoom in general. So overly technical questions I will probably not be able to answer, and I'll probably have to defer to one of my new co-authors here in computer science and engineering. But with that, let me begin. So after a number of high-profile breaches, US cyber strategists and policymakers talked about wanting to go on the offense in cyberspace. They said things like, all the advantages go to the attacker. And so calls to unleash the cyber defense led me to ask, is it better to be on the offense or the defense in cyberspace? Well, I mean, one of the important questions here is, why should anyone care about this sort of seemingly academic debate? Well, you can ask, do people like having an open internet? And then if they're not sure, we could just ask them, do they own a smartphone? And 99% of the people around you would raise their hands to say that they do. And if you do own a smartphone, then you do like having an open internet because you rely on it every day. So the problem that I would like to point out today is that a highly offensive cyber strategy and tactics and policy, which drives strategy and tactics, threatens internet openness. Okay? And there are all sorts of reasons why that is a problem. Okay, and this isn't just about stealing emails. Okay, there are some bigger issues at stake here when we're talking about cyber attacks. Really sophisticated cyber attacks can actually cripple countries. Okay, the Snowden revelations about what the NSA cyber capabilities could do showed that the US is already on the offense in cyberspace. Operation Olympic Games, otherwise known as Stuxnet, was used to attack the Natanz nuclear reactor in Iran. And Operation Nitro Zeus was developed to shut off the power in Iran, sort of as an escalation of something beyond Stuxnet. And we also know that Russia and China are executing and preparing for offensive cyber operations. Right? We know that Russia has attacked Ukraine's power grid and has penetrated the power grid of the United States. At present, we know that over 100 countries in the world, the majority of countries in the world, are developing offensive cyber capabilities. But this is a problem, I would argue, because there are significant dangers to developing a highly offensive cyber strategy, policy, and tactics. Well, there may never be a war of bits and bytes that decides the fate of nations, right? This is one of the great debates that we're having in cyber. But actions and reactions in cyberspace have serious implications for international relations. Cyber attacks on weaker states could actually lead to escalation. We may have even seen this recently, where we looked at the retaliatory attacks by terrorist groups or unconventional forces, right? This is how some weaker states might decide to respond to cyber attacks if they can't respond in kind through cyberspace. And the example I would say is that there's, seems to be a pretty clear connection between Iran's recent actions around the Strait of Hormuz and US cyber attacks on Iran. Reconnaissance for future attacks can be interpreted as the attack itself and can result in escalation. This is especially a problem if you think, what if you accidentally go into the same computer network that controls nuclear command and control, right? If you're discovered in there, the country may think that this is a preliminary to a splendid first strike and actually start a nuclear war based on that assumption. So prepping for attacks, for example, against North Korea's cyber army, to do that, you have to go through Chinese networks and actually probably Indian and European networks as well, because North Korea's cyber army is actually located all around the world. So if there's all these dangers, then we have to ask ourselves, well, why are states so interested in going on the offense? Well, there are a lot of things that are attractive about cyber covert action, right? Leaders are tempted to use cyber attacks because they seem to provide low cost and provide anonymity, right? When you engage in a cyber attack, there's no burnt out hulk of your special forces team's helicopter in the desert. This is a picture from Operation Eagle Claw, also known as Desert One, April 1980, which was the Carter administration's attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran, which failed. So the idea is that if you launch a cyber attack, instead what you see is, game over. Do you want to continue? Yes or no, right? It's a pretty low cost way of engaging in covert action. So it's a very attractive tool for the states that have the technological capabilities. So I would argue that offensive cyber attacks are attractive, but they are dangerous. And what I argue here is that we should confront calls for a cyber offense instead with insights about the power of the cyber defense. First of all, let's talk about why the cyber defense is so important for the United States. In the aftermath of the Cold War, so after the Soviet Union falls apart, the United States looks around at the international system and says, what are the biggest threats? And what they said was that the biggest threats are disruptions to the sea lines of communication that connect the rest of the world to the United States and the United States to the rest of the world. Now, today, the US must defend the cyber lines of communication, or the SILOCs. These are key to international commerce and communications, and they are therefore key to US prosperity and power. For example, international supply chains are managed through cloud servers and near real-time information only available because of internet connectivity. Okay, if you want to know the consequences of attacking those servers, just look up the NotPetya attack and its effect on Maersk, the international shipping giant. So as I was saying, I argue that having defensive tactics, a defensive strategy, and a defensive policy in cyber is essential for the United States, right? Because the United States, much like the sea lines of communication, has to protect the cyber lines of communication to protect its prosperity and really to protect the globalized economy. Ironically, the US's offensive actions in cyberspace actually endanger the cyber lines of communication and internet openness. An insecure internet will lead to cyber balkanization, or national internets. And this is a significant problem. There we go. Right? National internets might be more secure, but they'll be far less efficient, they'll be far less innovative, and they'll be more expensive because there will be no market competition for those cyber internets, national internets, sorry. So what I argue is that we must develop cyber tactics, strategy, and policy with a heavily defensive component because of the downside of a highly offensive emphasis. But luckily, the US can actually make a virtue of this necessity. Okay, so what's the basic approach here? Well, first of all, I argue that defensive cyber tactics, strategies, and policies have clear advantages over offensive ones. And I demonstrate this by importing insights about the power of the defense from conventional warfare into the cyber realm. My goals in the end are to reduce reliance on the cyber offense for the dangers, because of the dangers that I've set out, and to help develop better cyber tactics, strategies, and policies. Okay, 2 objections. The first is that a technical objection, right? The technology needed to execute the proposed defensive cyber plans that I'm proposing does not exist. That's someone who's technically savvy might ask. And my response is, well, if we look at the history of warfare and innovation, especially in the nuclear age, we know that conceptual work can actually drive technological innovation. Okay, so by developing concepts, we can actually help people who are building the technology think about problems in new ways and develop new solutions. Then there's a conceptual objection. People argue that importing concepts from other forms of warfare to cyber will fail and or hinder good cyber strategy and policy. Well, my response to that is, well, that ship has already sailed, right? Military concepts are already being imported into cyber, and the result has been calls for offense in cyber with all of its dangerous implications. People are also very concerned about the militarization of cyberspace, and they might say, well, if you want to bring in these military concepts, then we have to worry about the military getting out of hand in this realm as well. And the US has indeed militarized cybersecurity. There are cyber commands and cyber units in all parts of the US military and beyond. There are fears that the military will import their aggressive ideas into the cyber realm and push for things like preemptive cyber warfare. For instance, they might quote Patton, who said, "In case of doubt, attack." Right? Or there's a fear of a cyber cult of the offensive, right? And the cult of the offensive was the belief that all the great power militaries had before World War I, that offense had all the advantages, and that drove the countries to engage in worst case scenario thinking and really promote the offense. So people are worried if you bring the military into cyber, you're going to get a cult of the offensive, but with cyber weapons. And Clark and Kanacki, in their very good book, The Fifth Domain, argue that militaries think first of offensive weapons. It's in their DNA. And they argue that that's true in the cyber realm as well. Well, my research has shown that military thinkers are not always advocating offense. I argue that the experience of and preparation for war makes military officers cautious about the efficacy of force, right? And that's what I argue in my book, Military Realism, available on Amazon, shameless plug. In war, the easiest thing is very difficult because of constant friction. This is one of the main lessons that military officers learn from the preparation of and experience of war. This, rather, is their image of Napoleon, not the sort of bellicose, bombastic painting that we saw on the previous slide, right? But the ignominious retreat from Russia in the winter. Military experience breeds a respect for the power of the defense over the offense. And as my research and others have shown, military officers are very often less aggressive than their civilian counterparts. And here, a great source on this is former Secretary of Defense and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Robert Gates, who said, "It was my experience over the years that one of the biggest misimpressions held by the public has been that our military is always straining at the leash, wanting to use force in any situation. The reality is just the opposite. In more than 20 years of attending meetings in the Situation Room, my experience was that the biggest doves in Washington wear uniforms." So let me give you one example of how this played out in one scenario. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, General David SHOUP was becoming a little bit uncomfortable with all the loose talk about invading Cuba by land. as a possible response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so he put a map of the United States on the wall, and then superimposed a map of Cuba on top of it to show that it stretched all the way from Chicago to Washington, D.C. He then superimposed upon that a tiny little dot. And all the people in the room said, well, General, what is that dot? And he said, that, gentleman, represents the size of the island of Tarawa, and it took us 3 days and 18,000 Marines to take it. Okay, attack is hard, especially against a prepared defense. He could have also mentioned Iwo Jima, which is only 8 square miles, as compared to Cuba's 42,000 square miles, in which the US lost almost 7,000 dead and 20,000 wounded in action. Or Okinawa, which is only 1% of the area of Cuba, where the US lost 65,000 casualties, the Japanese 70,000 killed, and 100,000 civilians killed. So my argument is that militaries have insights about the power of the defense, and actually their inclination is to respect the power of the defense rather than always promote the offense. Cutting the military out of cyber because of the fears of their aggressive mentality cuts us off from their insights about defense and their caution about offense. These insights are essential in the face of the dangers of a cyber offense that I've already set out, and that those dangers are neglected by the advocates of the cyber offense. After 10 years, there's already evidence that Cyber Command is far more defensive than offensive. As Clark and Kanaki had to admit, surprise, Cyber Command wasn't offensive enough, right? Well, that was surprising to them, but I would argue not surprising to me or people who would agree with my conclusions. So what are the military insights about the power of the defense? During the Cold War, scholars and the public were worried that the US Army was obsessed with the offense, that a cult of the offensive was forming in the Cold War. But an examination of their doctrine showed that the US Army was not focused on offense during the Cold War. The US and NATO allies were hopelessly outnumbered in Europe. The US Army therefore had to develop a defensive doctrine, and I show that they did that between 1962 and 1986. However, many of you are probably not well-versed in military tactics, so you might ask, why did being outnumbered necessitate a defensive doctrine? Well, very appropriately on this Remembrance Day, let's go back to World War I. Let's talk about the Battle of the Somme, right? This is a British attack in 1916 on the Western Front. A one-week preparatory barrage of 1,437 artillery pieces fired 1,500,000 shells. On the first day of the battle, July 1st, 1916, 19,000 soldiers are killed, 35,000 wounded, and 2,152 missing. At the Battle of Passchendaele the following year, the British, which is a British and French and Canadian attack on the Western Front, the preparatory barrage was 3,500,000 shells. The French and British still sustained 400,000 casualties. Why so bloody? Right? With this kind of firepower, why were these battles so bloody? Well, the problem was that they were going up against the Germans, who were masters of a concept called the defense in depth. And the defense in depth inflicted horrific casualties on the attacker. Okay, so if you look at this diagram, you can see that these stars here, this is the area of the preparatory barrage. As the attack goes into the defense in depth, they have to fight their way through all of these strong points. And then Once they get through these strong points, they have machine gun pits, and the Germans are ready, as always with the Germans, are ready to counterattack. And they did with great success. So what are the tactical advantages of the defense, right? What explains the effectiveness of this defense in depth? Well, first of all, think about it this way. For the attacker to subdue the defender, they must expose themselves to deadly fire, right? They have to move to actually engage the defender. And that's why the tactical rule of thumb is that for every one defender, you need 3 attackers to subdue them. The defender knows the terrain better than the attacker. The attacker must traverse ground that is prepared by the defender, right, with things like barbed wire and intersecting fields of fire, all prepared in advance. And then the defender uses these things to channel the attacker into an unfavorable position. The defender wears down the attacker, right? When the attacker concentrates against the defender then withdraws into the defense in depth, and the attacker must begin the concentration process all over again. Another advantage the defender has is that the defender observes the attacker. Okay? The defense in depth helps the defender gather information on the attacker's capabilities, mode of operations, and intentions. Well, how do they do that? Let me give you a simple example. This is an image of a German concrete machine gun nest from the Argonne Forest in World War I. And one of the tactics that the Germans used is that they would leave some of these defensive positions empty, right? The attacker would deploy to eliminate the empty position. Of course, the attacker, to look at it, doesn't know the position is empty, and they're obviously not going to take that risk. So they deploy to take down the defensive position. All the while, the defender is observing their deployment, gathering intelligence on their forces, what kind of support they have, air, artillery, what methods of attack they're using, and what are their intentions. This intelligence is then disseminated through the whole defense to strengthen it, and producing no advantages for the attacker. Okay, one obvious objection here at the level of tactics would be that this is great that the defender has all these advantages, but only the attacker enjoys the initiative, right? The attacker is acting, but the defender is reacting, and that is one of the main advantages of the attack. Well, on the contrary, the US Army rediscovered during the Cold War, the defender could actually have the initiative if the attacker is responding to the defender's plan. Previously, the defensive advantage meant that there was a 3-to-1 rule of thumb, but Army doctrine in the 1960s and 70s said that due to the range and lethality of modern weapons, that had actually increased to 6-to-1. And 6-to-1 is the ratio used in today's US Army. So there's still a very powerful respect for the defense in today's US Army. But the defenders have even greater advantages. They also have important advantages when it comes to transitioning to attack. Okay, so these I would call the offensive advantages of the defense. The best offense, in fact, starts with a good defense, right? The defender transitions to the attack when the attacker enjoys none of the advantages of the defense that I've just set out. Okay, for example, just think of transition basketball or an interception in football, right? The other team, the defense catches the ball, and then the defense is, running against a bunch of players who have been trained to play on offense, right? So they have all sorts of advantages, right? Who hasn't seen, when the last line of defense is the quarterback, usually you're going to get a touchdown, right? On an interception. So therefore, the most efficient attack is actually when we begin with a stalwart defense, preferably in depth, and then counterattack. So there's also important offensive advantages for the defense. Okay, how do we import these insights about the power of the defense into the cyber realm? Well, as I said, in war, the defender can leave the first few positions empty to give the impression of vulnerability and draw in the attacker. In cyberspace, the defender can do the same thing. They can leave obvious vulnerabilities in their network and draw in hackers. While this is happening, the defender gathers information on the attacker's capabilities, intentions, and, very importantly in cyber, their origin and their identity. Right? All the while, the defender can remain concealed. Gathering this intelligence is one of the main advantages of the defense in cyber. This helps overcome what is considered one of the biggest problems in cyber, which is anonymity, right? Identifying who the attacker is. And this isn't just pie in the sky thinking, right? Since cyber defense began, cyber defenders have been using these capabilities as early as the 1980s, right? Clifford Stoll, in his defense of the Berkeley Laboratory Network in 1986, right, and used honeypots and false networks to channel a hacker into his network. And that whole time, he gathered information on the attacker's capabilities, intentions, and origin. What he discovered was that he was a West German hacker selling secrets to the KGB. And today, we also see the power of the cyber defense in action. One example, Operation Cross Swords, which was an exercise by NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, in which a NATO red team of hackers was trying to break into a network defended by a private security firm. The private security firm employed decoy machines with a fictitious human resources database. The red team used credentials from this database, right, to try and access a fictitious network. The defender prepares the terrain in the network that the attacker will enter. Okay, so very similar to conventional warfare. The attacker thought that they had the initiative the entire time, but actually they were responding to the defender's plan. And here's a quote from the leader of the cyber defense team. The web hacking team spent a lot of time trying to crack the first decoy that they had encountered, the HR database. We saw them trying to authenticate using all the credentials they had collected, and then run a lot of different queries and GET requests to try to hack the decoy. Throughout the exercise, they did not give up. This would prove very valuable for defenders in a real world scenario, as we not only gain clear intel from the attacker's actions, it also wasted their time and resources throughout the week. Okay? And the wasting of time is very important, right? Because time is the one resource in war that you cannot get back, right? Napoleon said, I would rather lose a whole army than an hour. Okay, so time is the only resource you can't get back. A stalwart cyber defense wastes the attacker's time. The attacker can also be stopped when the attacker is frustrated by a well-ordered defense, and then they break off the attack. The ability to frustrate the attacker is exponentially greater in cyberspace than it is on the conventional battlefield. And that is because the terrain in cyber, remember I said the defender prepares the terrain that the attacker enters into. The terrain in cyber is man-made. It can be manipulated in ways impossible in the natural world. The defender can literally shift the ground under the attacker's feet. Okay, we've actually, again, seen this in real world cases, right? The MITRE cybersecurity firm decided that they would not make ejection of the attacker out of their network their main priority. Because really, if you think about it, breaking into a network is only step one for the cyber attacker, right? The attacker must then pivot across the network to reach their objective. To do that, they have to map the network, right? For example, the Russians, when they broke into the Democratic National Committee's network, they spent months in the network mapping it out before they escaped with their trove of emails. Once breached, the MITRE cyber defenders observed the attacker attempting to map and pivot across the network. They then reconfigured the network to make the attacker's maps obsolete. In doing so, they wasted the attacker's time, all while observing the behavior of the attacker to discover their methods, their intentions, what tools they were using, and who they were. So if you recall how frustrating the defense in depth was to the attacker in World War I, right? Because the terrain in cyberspace is man-made, and you can actually have it entirely fictitious networks, right? The attacker can actually be lost in a maze of multiple different defenses in depth, all the while the defender gathering this important information on the attacker. Okay, but what if you have to go on the offense? Well, as I said, the cyber defender has superiority in counterattack because of all the intelligence they've gathered about the attacker's capabilities, methods, intentions, and identity. Their counterattack will also likely achieve surprise because the defender is often going to be unobserved by the attacker. So again, the best cyber attack, as in conventional warfare, the best attack is one followed by a counterattack after a stalwart defense. So what does this mean? It means that even offensive cyber doctrine and strategy should have defensive elements. If we flip the script on the United States, for instance, right, the corollary of this analysis is if the US is on the offense in cyber, then all the advantages of the defense that I've just set out rest with the opponents of the United States, right? While the US is attacking, they are gaining knowledge for a potentially devastating cyber counterattack against the United States. So what's the balance between offense and defense in cyber? Well, in the early internet, it favored the attacker because of its openness. But now the technology, I argue, has shifted the balance back to the defender. This is actually very similar to the German blitzkrieg at the beginning of World War II, right? This new technology initially favored the attacker until the defender combined that technology with the built-in advantages of the defense described above. And the results of combining blitzkrieg technology with the defense in depth were absolutely devastating to the Germans and to the Allies when the Germans used it on them. The same thing has happened in cyberspace. Okay, so that's it for the tactical advantages of the defense. What about the strategic and policy advantages of being on the defense? Here we need to turn to someone who I hope that you're familiar with, but I'm worried that you might not be, and that is Karl von Clausewitz. Wrote a book called On War. And he is a great source for talking about international relations and cyber defense. Okay, so what did Clausewitz say? Well, as I have shown, defense has many tactical advantages to recommend it in both conventional war and cyber war. But Clausewitz argued that defense also had major strategic and political advantages. He argued, for instance, that in international relations, there is a tendency among states towards the promotion of the status quo and stability, and away from revision and instability. Aggressive states, he argued, will encounter friction from the whole for that reason. The defender of the status quo and stability, Clausewitz said, will find that it has more friends than enemies, and this vigorous defense will attract allies. So the US should be, I argue, the defender of stability and the status quo in the cyber realm. They need to be the main defender of the Psylocks. A robust defense of cyberspace will draw allies because so many countries, private companies, individuals depend on the open Psylocks and the cyber status quo that keeps them open. defensive tactics have major strategic advantages, right? Intelligence gathering is just one. Remember, we talked about the defense in depth. Well, one of the great advantages is that if you and your allies are using a defense in depth, you're gathering lots of information about attackers. So if you're allies, you're sharing that information, and that strengthens everyone's defense. Cyber alliances and partnerships are key because stopping attacks requires cooperation from private industry and other countries, right? This isn't just international relations 101 sort of alliance systems between countries. We're talking about alliances between countries, but also between countries and private industry. Aggressive cyber tactics, I argue, will undermine trust between the US and present and potential allies in the cyber realm. One of the big things we need to be careful of in the cyber realm, as we were talking about just before I began, right, is the danger of threat inflation. Many people point to the idea that the enemies of the United States, like North Korea and Iran and Russia, right, can punch above their weight in cyber, and therefore they're extra dangerous, right? But the fact of the matter is, so can the allies of the United States. The UK, Canada, the Netherlands, Israel, India, right, can all have developed and will develop impressive cyber capabilities. Cybersecurity could even provide, and has begun to provide, a key role for NATO allies, right? This will be less costly than building a conventional military capability because it's also in their economic interest to do so. Many of the key silocs pass through these countries. Aggressive cyber tactics, strategies, and policies endanger open cyber lines of communication, and they therefore endanger US interests and security. So in conclusion, cyberspace is not necessarily offense dominant at either the tactical, strategic, or political level. Defensive cyber capabilities have clear advantages over offensive ones. But unfortunately, it appears that the US is on the offense. Military insights, I argue, about the power of the defense can help us develop better cyber tactics, strategies, and policies, avoid unnecessary escalation, and better protect the US interests and the prosperity that we all enjoy. In cyberspace, the US must be primarily on the defensive. And the US, I argue, can actually make a virtue of this necessity. Thank you.
So in terms of then sort of the practical ways that that the US military can set itself up for a defensive cyber strategy, are there ways that institutions need to change the way that they operate for this? Is the current structure of US Cyber Command done in a way that makes using cyber defensively possible?
I mean, it makes it possible for defending some of the most important networks that the US military and government and intelligence community depend on, right? But even things like the SIPRNet, right, which is the secret communications of the Pentagon, right, have been hacked into. You will be very disturbed to hear how that happened. Some Russian operatives went outside of a base in Afghanistan and they threw a bunch of USB ports on the ground in the parking lot. Somebody picked up one of those USB ports, walked into the base and plugged it into a computer. Okay, so the biggest problem in cybersecurity is the gray matter that's in between our ears, right? So yes, it's possible, but there's I think they have a long way to go. I don't think they're as vulnerable as everybody thinks, but really, if we think about this, this has to be not only a whole of government approach, but the whole government has to be involved, but also private companies, right? Because the advantages to having private companies involved closely with the US military and the US government is that often they are going to be the ones, and especially other countries like Ukraine, India, right? They're going to be the ones that are going to be attacked first, right? We know, for instance, that Russia tested out a bunch of its penetration tools on Ukraine before it went into the wider world and started using them more broadly, right? We could expect the same thing between India and China. So when those tools get used in the near abroad of those countries, right, we want to know as soon as possible what the tools were and how we can defend ourselves against them, right? Another sort of disadvantage of being on the offense in cyber is that if you fire a piece of artillery at somebody, right, you fire a shell at somebody, it hits and explodes, and you're like, well, okay, they shot us with some artillery. A cyber weapon is different, right? You attack someone with a cyber weapon, and then they can actually take that weapon and examine its characteristics, right? So that's actually a pretty huge disadvantage for the attacker, right? So there's actually disadvantages to the attacker I didn't even have time to go into just because, I didn't want to talk for 2 hours. So yes, I think some of the structures are there within the military organizations and the intelligence apparatus itself. The problem is going to be, how do you extend that web of defense out to other countries and especially into the private sector, right? Google doesn't really trust the NSA, for instance, right? So how do we sort of repair those relationships? Because those kinds of private companies are going to be so important in mounting the kind of cyber defense in depth that would really take advantage of the advantages of the defense at all levels that I've set out here. So yeah, great question. A lot of work to be done, but I also do think that the vulnerabilities have been overstated in some ways.
We actually have a question here from Ryan Knuckles. How are you seeing the US-China relationship evolving in the cyber realm? With the US currently engaged in confrontational rhetoric and a confrontational conventional force posture, is there hope that the US will not engage in cyber offensive against the PRC?
Okay, so one of the weirdest things about cyber that sort of makes it unlike many other forms of conflict is that we probably have not seen the most devastating kinds of cyber attacks yet, right? Because what is required for a cyber attack, for the sort of most devastating types of cyber attacks to be used, is a crisis, right? And the US has not yet gotten into a major crisis against China, right? But the potential is there, especially in the South China Sea, right? So you can imagine if the US and China are savvy, and they are, right, they're going to hold back their most devastating cyber weapons, right? So the question is, well, how do you prepare for something you don't even know what it is? And I would argue that actually that's where the elasticity of a defense in depth is best, right? Because it will allow you to absorb that new attack, right? Examine what its properties are, and then counterattack effectively, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that any major war or military engagement between the PRC and the US will involve cyber, right? I just have no doubt. Whether it's only going to be cyber or whether it's going to be a combination of cyber and military or unconventional attacks, cyber will be involved somehow, right? And I know that the US is preparing and China is preparing to go on the offense against their adversaries in those scenarios. I think it would be we'd be too naive to think that they're not doing that. But the question is, does that mean that we need to be on the offense all the time in cyber? And the answer I would say is no, right? In fact, we should have a heavier emphasis on defense. And in part, I would say one of the reasons you do that is because it actually makes your ability to counterattack way more potent, right? And then the other thing is, allies. The U.S. Winston Churchill said the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. Right? This idea that the U.S. has to have a network of allies to confront China with, and doing that is going to require trust between them and the allies and their allies, and I would say especially in the cyber realm. Right? The U.S. has some pretty formidable allies in the cyber realm who you wouldn't think, the UK, Israel, right? They're militarily powerful, or they're not that militarily powerful, but in cyber, they definitely punch above their weight. So yeah, that's a great question, and one that we're all speculating about right now.
Bouncing off the idea of the importance of allies in cyber warfare, we have a question here. Are our most threatening cyber attacks done in coalitions or in singularity? Additionally, are such attacks usually rogue or government sponsored?
Well, it's a combination, right? And so we see really interesting combinations, right? Sometimes they're, rogue activist groups. Sometimes they're criminals just trying to get money, right? Sometimes they're just hackers who want to see if they can break into a specific system, right? And then sometimes they're actually a combination of these things, so that governments who maybe don't have very sophisticated cyber capabilities will actually employ cyber mercenaries to engage in actions against their adversaries, both because they don't have the capabilities and they hope that it's going to give them a certain amount of anonymity by using these proxies. The danger is you don't really know what the proxy is going to do, right? The proxy may do some of what you want to do, but then also engage in activities that's contrary to your interest. So there are risks there. If you look at something like Stuxnet, right, that was a combination of people in private industry, Israel and the United States, all working together to build the Stuxnet malware that they used against the Natanz nuclear reactor, right? So far what we've seen, it seems like the most effective ones would be a combination of these different things. But in terms of security, obviously you could see big advantages of just using your own military to do it instead of bringing in other allies. But in general, for the United States, it's always been better to fight in coalition than to fight by itself. Right, and I mean, we haven't even talked about the concept of international law, right, or international norms, right? If you fight in coalition to protect the cyber status quo, then you're going to have more support internationally for your actions. So yeah, great question. It's a combination of all those different kinds of actors.
You mentioned earlier that cyber attacks in a weaker state could lead to escalation.
Mm-hmm.
How can escalation be mitigated when cyber defense takes an offensive strategy, when it goes on like the counteroffensive, as you talked about, or the counterattack?
Yes, I mean, escalation is an option to resolve a conflict, right? So, the other thing that I would mention from Clausewitz is, defense is passive, right? So you sit back and you absorb attacks, right? And you might engage in limited counterattacks, but if you really want to stop that attack in its tracks, you have to counterattack, right? Because, I mean, if you think about it this way, right? If the attacker is frustrated and then stops attacking, that's their choice, right? Whereas if you want to force a choice on the attacker, you need to attack them in turn, right? So I don't want to argue that there would never be a need for offense, because I think that is almost always the case. Well, hopefully not always, but we'd be pretty naive not to prepare for offense, because you don't know how determined your adversary is, right? Offense might be the only option to stop certain kinds of attacks. So I'm assuming that if you're going on the counterattack, escalation has already happened. But then the question becomes, what kind of counterattack? Right? So if you engage in a limited counterattack, you might actually be able to reduce the odds of escalation. Right? it depends on how sort of strong and how widespread the effects of your counterattack are. Okay, if you attack, melt down a few servers, that's one thing. If you shut off the power in the attacker's city, that's next level, right? So how you decide to counterattack is going to have a pretty big effect on escalation, right? So let me just give you a real world example, right? Look at the Iranian attacks on the oil refineries in Saudi Arabia, right? What do we notice about those attacks? They were attacks, they were very aggressive, but if you think about it, the most important element of those attacks is that nobody got killed, right? They purposely attacked the refineries when they knew nobody was going to be there because they wanted to send a signal, but they didn't want a massive escalation of the conflict, right? So we see this in all sorts of, right? I mean, in general, states would like to keep conflicts from escalating if they can help it, right? You know, if you ask the Russians in 1914 if they wanted to keep the war between just them and Austria over Serbia, they would have said yes, right? But the war escalated sort of beyond the wildest fears of the great powers involved. So yeah, it depends how you counterattack. And I think that's actually one of the most important things is we need to figure out how to counterattack in a way that doesn't lead to massive escalation of conflicts, right? That sends a signal that, hey, we know who you are, we know what you're doing, and we could do much worse than this, but we're choosing not to. We'd like you to stop your attack now, right? Because again, once the attacker realizes that anonymity has been lost, then they start to think twice about what it is they're doing. And I would argue that cyber defense is the best way to undermine the anonymity issue.
Sort of staying on the same topic, how would you say that the disconnect from a physical battlefield is a detriment to a policy of defensive cyber warfare?
Yeah, I mean, like I argued, I actually think the advantages of the defense that we learn from conventional warfare are actually greater in cyberspace because of the differences between the physical battlefield and computer networks, right? So it doesn't actually, the defense is actually more powerful in cyberspace than it is in conventional warfare. And then the other thing that I would mention is, I think it's really good to look back at the Cold War, right? I mean, we think we know an awful lot about how a nuclear war would have played out, but luckily we never had to actually do it, right? And that's because we thought conceptually about the problems of nuclear war and escalation dominance and mutually assured destruction, right? So we can do a lot of really important conceptual work that hopefully makes us not have to engage in full-on cyber war where we're shutting down power grids in other countries, for instance. So, well, if I could just say, it's been a real pleasure talking to you guys tonight, and feel free to reach out to me. I know that the organizers here have my email contact, so if you have further questions or insights that you want to share with me that I can then steal and put in my own work, I'd be more than happy to do that. So just reach out anytime if you have any questions about the talk today or any of the other work that I'm doing.